Our Around the World segment tonight, lawyers for retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn told President Donald Trump's transition team before the inauguration that Flynn might need to register with the government as a foreign agent. A White House spokesperson said President Trump had not been informed that Flynn had lobbied for a foreign government, but this does raise questions about whether Flynn was fully vetted before being given a White House post. With me now to dive into it from the Washington Free Beacon, Adam Kredo. Adam, good to see you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Adam, this is kind of shady behavior on the part of General Flynn here. He did register as a foreign agent with the Department of Justice just recently because he allegedly lobbied on behalf of the Turkish government, or at least for Turkish interests within the Turkish government. You know how there's always that indirect association there. This happened from August to November of 2016, but it leads me to the question, at least, is this why his conversation with the Russian ambassador was recorded or was tapped, because he had these ties to other foreign interests?
It could potentially be possible. I would say that the nature of the meetings themselves are not particularly odd, especially if you're doing foreign policy consulting work. This is typical. I know many people that I actually use as sources that are registered with FARA, and it's all above board. And as long as you report your ties and conversations with these governments, it's not a problem. I think that for Flynn, this doesn't look very good, kind of full stop, because like the conversations with the Russian officials, he didn't seem to inform the White House about it. That I find kind of odd. If everything was above board, why would you neglect to mention it in normal course of conversation? It's the same thing we saw with him with these conversations with the Russians. I just don't get that part of it, and it's unclear to me why the Trump people didn't know in advance about this. They've put themselves back in another tricky position where, again, they're on defense when they really don't have to be.
Right, and that might even be a diplomatic way to say it. I mean, I find it to be a bit further than odd. I find it to be, like I said, I'm going to use the word again, I find it to be very shady. You didn't disclose that you were lobbying on behalf of the Turkish government before you were appointed as national security advisor for the Trump campaign. I mean, that's a huge conflict of interest, and it's just a level of dishonesty that you wouldn't tell your boss that you had that conflict of interest. Super, super strange to me. But the new development in this is that the Trump transition team, or at least there's allegations that the Trump transition team was warned that he was lobbying on behalf of the Turkish government, but that they just ignored it.
That does actually seem to be the case. It does seem that in some way or fashion this actually came up. Now, how high in terms of the Trump campaign at that time it got to is unclear to me at this point, and some people I've reached out to this afternoon haven't really been able to explain to me that part of it either. I'll tell you why I find this particularly interesting, just kind of from the 50,000-foot perspective. I had heard rumblings recently, just kind of talk, but from the inside of the White House, about maybe a campaign to potentially bring Flynn back on, that is, rehire him, because a lot of people are still angry about the way he was pushed out of the administration. Now, whether you agree with him on his policies and his behavior, I think we all can agree that the way he was forced to resign, that is, leaking classified information against him, was a very bad thing and not helpful to anybody. So I think this might actually dash any hope anybody in the White House might have had about him potentially returning. I don't think there's any way they could bring him back. He's too far tainted now.
Right, and I think this might be the tipping point, not to make a bad pun right now. But I agree with you. I didn't have a problem with the fact that he spoke with the Russian ambassador. My problem was the reason President Trump stated that he asked for Flynn's resignation, and that's that he misled Vice President Pence, that he wasn't honest about that he lied. And I do think that was a political hack job. But I mean, I would openly advocate for him not to be brought back now, because I mean, part of his lobbying, and maybe you can speak to this more than I can, but part of his lobbying was he, on behalf of Turkish interests, on behalf of the government, again, that indirect chain, he was lobbying to extradite Fethullah Gulen. I mean, that's a very touchy topic between Turkey and the U.S.
Huge point of contention. A lot of people don't know about Fethullah Gulen, who is a Islamist leader and scholar, actually runs and operates all across the world, but particularly in the U.S., a bunch of schools. The ruling party in Turkey has long harbored ill will towards Gulen. They accuse him of being responsible for orchestrating this coup attempt that we saw a couple months ago. So a lot of bad blood between the government and Gulen. Now, what Flynn was doing exactly is unclear to me. It's not entirely certain at this point whether he was operating on behalf of the government or on behalf of interests close to the government. There actually is a legal distinction there that qualifies whether you have to register with FARA or not. So I think that it probably is closer tied to the government than we thought, given the fact that they just informed the Justice Department of this, or at least an attempt to kind of cover themselves in case there is some sort of action coming down the pike.
Right, and just to emphasize it again, there is that legal distinction, but how people get around that legal distinction, they use a loophole where they lobby for interests who are just tied to the government themselves. So it's that indirect link, but it amounts to the same thing, even if it legally doesn't. I mean, Flynn went so far as he wrote an op-ed, and this was back in November, right after the election, comparing Gulen to, he called it Turkey's Osama bin Laden. That's pretty serious. That's pretty serious lobbying.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. And it's interesting, particularly in the case of Gulen, because there is a crowd of people that find him entirely objectionable and use comparisons like that, while there's another, the Obama administration in particular, saw him as a potential Islamist figure that could kind of close the gap between the West and some of these true believers in the Middle Eastern world. And there's evidence that kind of supports both sides. So Gulen is a particularly interesting figure in that sense. And I would mention, lives in the mountains, the Poconos of Pennsylvania, very reclusive, doesn't go out in public very often. And I know that the Turkish government would like to get their hands on him. They've been fighting for quite some time to put him and his truest believers into prison for a lot of their engineering of coup attempts and infiltrating of police and other government bureaucracies in Turkey.
Right. The United States government essentially has been protecting him by allowing him to live in Pennsylvania for these years. Adam, we're out of time, about 20 seconds left here, but did Flynn do anything criminal in your opinion?
No, I don't see any evidence of that point. I think the term you use, shady, is actually kind of appropriate here. There's nothing wrong with what we do in terms of FARA and journalists and consultants doing that type of work and operating that way as long as it's reported. At this point, I don't see anything criminal. If they didn't report it, that would have been a major issue.
Right, and he's at least covered his tail at this point by going ahead and registering with the Department of Justice as a foreign agent.
So.
Adam, thanks for being here today. It was great to talk to you.